would be nice to think there wasn't one rule for some and one for the other. There clearly was, and it's really important that we understand the nature of the brief that Prince Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was given when he became trade envoy, because the others certainly weren't getting massages on the taxpayer. But while this debate concerns Mountbatten-Windsor, it's not about one man. It's really about the structural sexism that is embedded in our institutions. Violence against women and girls doesn't persist in this country for a lack of speeches in this chamber. It persists because structurally it's still not treated as foundational to our policy making. There are many members across this House utterly committed to tackling violence against women and girls. Many have dedicated their political lives to this cause, often in the face of horrific abuse. This isn't a party political issue, nor is it about individual commitment. It's about whether the system itself is designed to prioritise women's safety, and too often it's not. Defence is seen as core business, the Treasury is seen as core business, infrastructure is seen as core business. But violence against women and girls is too often siloed, assigned to one minister and under one strategy, as though half the population's safety is a niche concern rather than a central test of whether the state is functioning. Sure.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does she not agree with me that a powerful illustration of the point she's making is that women inequalities ministerial questions in this place gets just 30 minutes each week, and a very compressed one just before Prime Minister's questions each time?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I'm actually just coming on to give another example of the way in which this sexism is embedded. I recently wrote to both the Minister of Housing and the Minister of Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls to ask why the recent draft National Planning Policy Framework made no mention of women and girls' safety, bearing in mind that this document sets out how we design and build the spaces and places we live in. The response from the MHCLG was jaw-dropping. They said, and I quote, "The NPPF is a planning document. It sets out guidelines for house building and planning in England. The Vorg strategy is about protecting women and girls from violence and misogyny. It's unclear as to why anyone would expect the two things to be combined. If it's unclear to the department responsible for planning why violence on women and girls should be considered in their work, then we have a structural problem." And this is where structural sexism becomes inseparable from power, because who makes the decisions matter. In this country, a remarkably small circle of people, disproportionately male, disproportionately drawn from the same networks, still make the most consequential choices.
Would my honourable member give way?
Sure.
I thank my honourable member friend for giving way when she's making an extremely important point. And on the issue of structural violence against women and girls, would my honourable friend agree with me that it is women and young girls who are the most vulnerable in the face of climate change and those disasters, natural disasters as a result, and exposed to violence, rape against young women and girls when they are displaced from their homes as a result? Now, as trade envoy, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor toured Gulf boardrooms, met alongside Shell executives, energy conglomerates, and that was, ermine royal access diplomacy. So just as in his personal life, he showed no conscience towards those women and young girls of victims and survivors of a convicted paedophile Epstein, in his role as trade envoy, nor did he think about those who were exposed to structural violence of women and young girls also.
Yeah, I totally agree. I couldn't have said it better. The people in these circles appoint one another, they defend one another, and they rehabilitate one another. And sometimes they do so in ways that many women looking on in that situation would not. And when the same small group repeatedly decides what's reputationally survivable, what's politically convenient, and what's worth overlooking, women's confidence in our institutions erodes, which is how this circles back to Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. Because the issue isn't only his personal conduct. It's about cultures of deference, it's about protective networks, and it's about systems where rehabilitation for powerful men can move faster than justice or safety for women, which is precisely why transparency matters. When decisions are taken within small, powerful circles, sunlight is not a luxury, it's a safeguard. If Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was appointed and maintained as a special trade envoy, then the public is entitled to understand how that decision was reached, what advice was given, what risks were assessed, and who signed it off. We cannot say we are serious about accountability while withholding the very documents that would allow this House and the public to scrutinise how power was exercised. Releasing all correspondence, risk assessments and internal advice relating to his role as trade envoy is not about political point scoring. It's about restoring trust, because transparency is the antidote to institutional deference, and without it, structural sexism continues to operate behind closed doors.
Helen Maguire.
No. Sorry. You sure?
As I start to contribute to this debate, I do have to pause to pay tribute to all the young women who have risked so much to stand up and push for justice over the vile and corrupt web around the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein and the crimes and abuse they suffered as children. But turning to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and the motion before us today, transparency about the workings of an organisation is a key way to prevent corruption. Sunlight really is the best disinfectant. And appreciating that there is an ongoing police investigation that mustn't be jeopardised, Green MPs support the motion in the name of the Liberal Democrats, whilst noting the Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton's apology for defending Andrew Mountbatten Windsor as doing an excellent job whilst in office in 2011 and the reasons he gave for that. This is when Paul Flynn, the formidable late former MP for Newport West, held this debate in the House in 2011 that other members have referred to. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the royal family is sheltered from scrutiny in too many ways, and it's very, very clear now what a risk this can pose. We have heard many examples of MPs facing restrictions and limits on what we can ask about royal activity, but it is reasonable and right that we should scrutinise any work they do on the country's behalf in the fullest way possible, and we look at how these restrictions can be removed and others. Now, as I understand it, Section 37 of the Freedom of Information Act exempts communications between relevant authorities and members, not just the King, but wider members of the royal family, from being released under Freedom of Information requests. Now, that really is one rule for the rich and powerful and one rule for the rest of us, as the Minister condemned earlier. And I believe this is a serious transparency loophole for royals that must be closed. For example, it could mean that if positions such as trade envoy are filled by members of the royal family, it would be, predictably, significantly harder for the press, public and MPs to make sure things are above board, and much harder to get details when things go very, very badly wrong. One example of the effect of this on transparency is in today's Guardian, where there's a profile of the author Andrew Lowney, who's the author of a biography of Andrew called Entitled, and he talks about the stacks he has of rejected freedom of information requests from different government departments. This is why this humble address is so important, as it would uncover whether these restrictions in the FOI Act were in fact part of the equation in making the appointment. I have tabled early day motion 2769, which now has support from MPs of 6 political parties, calling for the King to release all communications between members of the royal family and the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein. But obviously that is just the start of what is needed. I'm very grateful for the motion today. If reports are correct that the royal family were aware of concerns about Andrew's financial dealings ahead of his appointment, there are serious questions about whether and how that knowledge matches the King's statement following Mountbatten Windsor's arrest, suggesting he had only recently learned about his brother's misconduct. And it is reasonable to raise these questions too and find out what advice was given from the palace at the time, including as suggested by the current King, for or against the appointment. And I want to add that reactive cooperation with any investigation cannot be enough on the royal family's part. That suggests waiting to be asked by the police, whereas the royal family could be proactively checking its records and visitor logs. It could be speaking to palace and Royal Lodge staff to encourage them to share information with the authorities. And it could be making sure there is an effective whistleblowing policy within the palace. We also need to be able to scrutinise the exact provenance of the £12 million payout from Andrew to the brave late Virginia Giuffre. So to conclude, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor should never have been a trade envoy for this country, but that is not the only matter that requires urgent transparency. His relationship with the child trafficker Jeffrey Epstein has turned the nation's stomach, and we also need to know who in the royal household knew what and when, as well as what he did when he was trade envoy. As part of ensuring that, I hope the Minister will make it clear today that royal freedom of information exemptions that have for too long allowed their power to act in the shadows, concealing important truths from MPs and the public, also need to go.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I'm one of a handful of MPs on these Liberal Democrat benches and on the current government benches who was elected in the wake of a political scandal. Yeah. In my case, in December 2021, a financial scandal followed by a cover-up by the then Conservative government trying to get one of their own off the hook. And then in the midst of that by-election, there was revelations about Partygate, where it emerged that the Prime Minister had concluded at the time, the Prime Minister of the time, had concluded that there was probably a number of rules that the people in this country that were subject to that didn't apply to him. And I can remember very, very clearly knocking on doors during that by-election and feeling the anger of my constituents that a small group of elite people had concluded that there was rules that applied to them that didn't apply to the people at the top of our society. And I think they would have described that as entitlement. And that's why this debate today is so important, because we must, to restore the trust of the people who voted for me and for those other people who were elected in the wake of by-elections following scandals, and the wider British public, we need to tell them that we've learnt those lessons about political scandal, about cover-up, about entitlement, and are taking actions to restore their trust in what this House is up to and what the wider establishment is allowed to get away with. It's so important to hold the powerful to account. And since then, we've had another of other scandals which have destroyed trust in politics. We've had the VIP lane for COVID contracts. We've had the treachery of Nathan Gill. And we've had the concerns surrounding the appointment of Peter Mandelson. Now, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was intimately involved with Jeffrey Epstein, and we've learned in recent weeks that the relationship was probably much more deep than we first thought and continued much longer than maybe we first thought. And this association with one of the most despicable paedophiles in history at the heart of the British establishment is absolutely poisonous. The victims and survivors of Epstein's crimes must have been re-traumatised many times over the year by the complicity of all those who were closely associated with him and did nothing to bring his crimes to public awareness and bring him to account. I will keep going.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. She makes a really important point about people who are victims of crimes perpetrated by people in the public eye, because it's particularly difficult for them, because it's almost like the trauma is repeated again and again when these things come to light, and obviously they're in the press and the media. Would you agree with me that we need to particularly support victims who are victims of crimes of this nature?
It makes an excellent point, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to be one of those victims or one of those survivors, and to see repeatedly over the years the establishment closing ranks around those that knew him and telling us everything was okay. And he's entirely right. This whole process must be extremely painful for everyone involved, and we should put them at the first and foremost of everything we do as we go forward.
On that point,
I'll keep going.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. One of the things that I've been struck by is that as we hear more and more and more revelations, I think it's quite difficult for some members of the public to keep up. And for many of them, particularly a number of women, they'll want to turn away from what they see on their screens. Does my honourable friend agree with me that as we see what is unfolding in front of our eyes is a conspiracy of silence, where horrific acts were allowed to take place in the shadows, and increasingly we are seeing the arms of the British state were either protected, facilitated or colluded with these horrific acts by people in power? Does she agree with me that this House must make the boldest statement it can that we will not rest until every single stone is unturned?
Helen Morgan.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. She puts it better than I could. She's entirely right. Because what we have seen here is complicity by people at the heart of the British establishment who we are in the right place to hold to account, but people as part of the international establishment, either turning a blind eye to the acts of Jeffrey Epstein, or possibly being implicated by them. We don't know that for sure yet. But those who did turn a blind eye must have known. They must have known what was going on. It isn't normal for an older businessman to be surrounded by young teenagers all of the time, to be receiving massages and all sorts of other, as we know, terrible involvements, and for other people to think that that was somehow normal or acceptable or even admirable, as we heard Donald Trump say. Some of those girls were on the younger side, as if that was something to be applauded. It was appalling. Those people must have known, and if they chose not to look, they are part of the problem. The decades-long cover-up, as I've said, must have compounded and worsened the trauma that those women, they were children at the time, compounded the trauma that they suffered. So first and foremost, let's put the victims first and let's allow the police investigations to go ahead. But we need to look at the wider elements of the scandal as well. As we've heard...
Would she give way?
I will.
I'm extremely grateful to her. Does she share my worry, though, that as it currently stands, the potential for human trafficking, which is at its core what those victims would have been the victims of, is actually not subject to a police inquiry currently? And would she, recognising of course that the police will make their own decisions, that is absolutely right, does she not agree that it is for this government to make sure they've got all possible resourcing that they might need, so that if they wanted to go down that particular rabbit hole, and I would urge them to do so actively, that they wouldn't be stymied by any lack of resource in that?
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point, actually. I will, and I...
Urge honourable members not to speculate about what the police might or might not be investigating.
Thank you very much. I thank the Minister for that reminder. I have been astounded, I have to say, by the brilliance of the British media and the journalists who have sifted through thousands and thousands of documents from the Epstein files and uncovered a scandal within a really, really short period of time that has rocked the British establishment to its heart and has got everybody in this place acting to try and uncover the appalling rot at the heart of the Epstein circle. And yet other jurisdictions who've been sitting on those thousands of documents for potentially decades have apparently had no curiosity whatsoever. And that in itself, I think, speaks volumes. I was going to say that the Polish government has launched an investigation into Epstein's links with Russia, and his links with both Peter Mandelson and Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor must be causing enormous concern in the light of that development. And so I think it's right now that we seek transparency into the appointment of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor to this role, because, as my honourable friend has just said, this wasn't about one mistake that led to an individual in an inappropriate position. This has been about a failure of an entire establishment to exercise curiosity, to undertake due diligence, and to put aside its, as an accountant we would call it, our professional scepticism, to put that aside and carry on with that appointment regardless, because that was an entitled person who needed a role. And so it's really, really important now, and I'm pleased that the government have agreed to comply with the request in this humble address and publish those documents. It's really, really important because the public need transparency. They need to understand quickly what happened and, crucially, what can be done in future to prevent such an appointment happening again. They need to have their trust restored, and they need to have their trust in this place restored, that we care enough to hold those powerful people to account and to make sure that we are always improving public life and not slipping backwards. The humble address itself seeks answers as to how a man with such a questionable reputation came to be appointed to represent the British state. But the debate today has highlighted the impenetrable networks of privilege that for decades have protected a paedophile and those who surrounded themselves with him, possibly for their own gain, and with total disregard for the victims of his crimes and the wider public to whom they were apparently indifferent. The government, when it came to power, promised to clean up British politics, There is a real moment of opportunity for them to demonstrate now that they are serious about that mission. And I hope they take that opportunity, and I hope they do this job properly.
Ian Solemn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This last week has been, by any measure, an extraordinary one in British public life. Within 5 days, 2 people have been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. One, a former member of the royal family. The other, a veteran Labour politician who was simultaneously, we now understand, the man who championed the first's appointment to his public role in the first place. Now, this motion is not an attempt to prejudice a police investigation. We are clear, let the police do their work. That investigation must proceed on its own terms, free from political interference. But the criminal law and parliamentary accountability are not the same thing, and they have never been mutually exclusive. Parliament has its own duty to scrutinise public appointments, to follow public money, and ensure that the institutions of state are answerable to the people they serve. That duty did not disappear when Thames Valley Police opened their case files. So let us ask the question that this House should have been asking for years. How did Andrew Mountbatten Windsor come to be appointed as Britain's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment in 2001? And what did those responsible for that appointment know? Because here is what we do know. His appointment was, by multiple accounts, controversial from the start. Concerns were raised within government, within the Foreign Office, and reportedly within the royal family itself. And yet he was appointed. For a decade, he travelled the globe on the public purse, meeting heads of state and billionaires with expenses described by former officials as lavish and poorly scrutinised, effectively given a rubber stamp. And all the while, his relationship with Epstein deepened. A relationship that the Epstein files now suggest may have been entangled with his official duties in ways that potentially breach both his duty of confidentiality and even the Official Secrets Act. The documents that might answer these questions should by now be in the National Archives under the 20-year rule. They are not. Every available exemption has been deployed to keep them sealed. National security, international relations and more. Some, we are told, are locked away until 2065. Most of us in this chamber would not be here to read them if they were. As the member for Argyll and the member for Brighton Pavilion, who's no longer in her place, have already raised, the historian Andrew Lowney has spent years attempting to access these files through the proper channels. When asked what he made of this, he said simply, "Every single reason has been deployed to stop these papers getting out. You have to ask why." Madam Deputy Speaker, we are asking why. Now, at this point, some may ask, if Parliament has had the tools to scrutinise this through a substantive motion, why is this happening only now? And it's a fair question. No party in over a decade successfully used the parliamentary mechanisms available to force this issue properly. Not because the rules prevented it, but because the cultural gravitational pull of deference was so strong that sustained rigorous scrutiny of a public figure who happened to be a member of the royal family felt, to too many people, like it simply wasn't the done thing. The unwritten convention was as powerful, if not more powerful, than the written rule. That aspect is not a procedural failure, it is a failure of political culture. And it is precisely that culture that this motion challenges today. Now, I came to this place with a background in science, and in any field of systemic inquiry, there is an important principle. You cannot correct a failure you refuse to examine. Institutional failures do not disappear when you look away from them. They compound. The question of how Andrew Mountbatten Windsor came to be appointed, against objections reportedly raised from multiple directions, and how he was then allowed to operate for a decade with expenses rubber-stamped and minimal oversight, is not ancient history. It is the context in which every subsequent failure of public appointment standards must be understood. Beyond this motion, the Liberal Democrats are calling for structural reforms that match the scale of what has been revealed so far. We want a genuinely independent ethics advisor, able to initiate investigations, not waiting for permission from the ministers they are supposed to scrutinise. We want an office of the whistleblower with real legal protections, so that the civil servant who was overruled when they tried to question an expenses claim has somewhere to go. We want a rigorous, transparent, confirmatory process for all significant public appointments, with proper parliamentary involvement from the outset, not as an afterthought, not after the damage has already been done. And we want to see an end to government by WhatsApp. All official business on the record, all lobbying published, no more deals done in the dark. Madam Deputy Speaker, deference is not respect, silence is not discretion, and secrecy in public life is not safety. It is the condition under which misconduct flourishes. The documents we are asking for today should have been in the public domain years ago. This House has the power and the responsibility to require their release, and it should do today. Thank you.
Here. Luke Taylor, I know you're in a lot of pain, Luke.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and you'll have to forgive me for my dancing around to aid my pain back. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Full quote from 1887 by British historian Lord Acton, and it explained how power in its most essential form inevitably corrupts. And I think we discuss here today how that absolute power, that feeling of invincibility, has led to the behaviour that we are all so utterly disgusted about around the chamber. I speak on behalf of all residents who've been in touch with me over the last few weeks, whether you are a Republican, a monarchist, ambivalent to the general principle. What we see is a scandal that is not just engulfing Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but also dragging in the integrity of the wider royal family, because, as has been raised by the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion so correctly, we have to ask who knew what and when. What was known about the £12 million that was paid out to Virginia Guthrie in 2022? And how was that allowed to be used to settle a civil suit of allegations of Andrew's offences? Alleged offences, I should say. How was that allowed to happen in the first place? As my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Surbiton, has already said, we've seen one friend of Epstein lobbying for a job for another friend of Epstein, and then a 12-year relationship that benefited them both financially and has now resulted in the two arrests for misconduct in public office. This humble address talks about how that began, and I think it is absolutely the right place to start. as a politician coming here, trying to convince the public that we are there to serve, we are there to represent them, that the conspiracies they read in the darker reaches of the internet are nonsense, and that there isn't a elite paedophile ring that runs the world's institutions, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when actually we see these links in the files that go directly from the Kremlin to the White House and everywhere in between, including the British royal family. We talk about standards in public life, we talk about integrity. It's very difficult to maintain, if not only that is known and the information in those files is understood by the public, but that then we're unable to scrutinise, we're unable to bring people to this place to ask questions about what has happened. So as discussed, this humble address covers quite a narrow set of papers that surround the appointment as the special envoy to the UK trade and industry. However, I think we've all discussed as well the parliamentary gymnastics that has been required to get a discussion of outrageous misdeeds allegedly conducted by that man to be discussed in this chamber. And it's those parliamentary gymnastics that I think we have to call out as being so outrageously an outrageous impediment to what our jobs are in this very chamber that we need to dispel from this place entirely. We talk about as well the implications of Andrew and his line of his position in the line of succession. I think at the time that the photos were published of him walking in New York with Jeffrey Epstein in 2011, he was fourth in line to the throne. We talk now of his position, but at the time that scandal was occurring, how close he was to the throne. It's disgusting. I think I'm going to ask the Minister specifically if he can give us an update on legislation that the government might bring forward to remove Andrew from the line of succession. We speak about, I think he's 8th in the line now, and maybe not such a worry, but the principle of that position to our head of state is obnoxious in the extreme, and I'd like to hear if he's got any update.
Give way.
Absolutely.
I think people just find this, we understand we have a living, breathing constitutional democracy that grows as society better understands things, but it just makes no sense, does it? That if the king doesn't want him to be a prince, it makes no sense that we have to still bring legislation in order to strip him of his dukedom and his earldoms, and equally that he remains in the line of succession and could potentially be a king. Now, yes, we've got plenty of other things we need to be getting on with, but there's a certain logic here that just needs tidying up, if nothing else.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I completely agree. I also want to thank the Minister for his very early acknowledgement of the support for the humble address today, and I also think that he has engaged constructively with comments about its scope, about exactly what it says, and I think that has been done in and broadly around the chamber, very much a supportive attitude. So I do thank him for that. I'm just going to return to the point about the negative privilege, that we cannot speak freely and have had to use this gymnastic approach to get to the point that we're at today. I've submitted a number of UQ requests to the Speaker's office, who has absolutely understandably not managed to get to justify a discussion of the scandal as it has unfolded, but the necessity that we've had to take to phrase it in the sense of an examination of the Prince's arrangements and his use of property and all sorts of confusing attempts to not then discuss it as we've mentioned around the chamber today has precluded us from doing.
I hate to add to this anguish, but there is a convention in the House that we don't refer to urgent question requests that we've put through to the Speaker.
And I will apologise for breaking that, but I think it is a useful demonstration, however rightfully and with such utter wisdom that we will never question, that the Speaker chooses. Again, it's that challenge to raise issues of this type in the Chamber. I will move to close, thank you. Specifically now, and I think the Liberal Democrat benches have been pretty clear on this throughout the afternoon, we have to have a full statutory inquiry into the whole Epstein affair and the tentacles that it has inserted into our public life. We must allow those criminal investigations to be completed, but that investigation must be able to compel witnesses and required to give evidence under oath and to produce documents and other evidence. This must be used not only to punish those who have been complicit and have been involved in the heinous crimes that we've heard about and seen about in the media, who again, and I will reflect other colleagues' comments about the incredible work that the media and journalists have done in investigating these crimes and pouring through those files. I really do think that cannot be overstated at the effort that they've taken on that. So just to conclude, we do have to ensure that the events that have transpired over the last 20, 30 years from Epstein's scandal can never be repeated, and that the investigation must allow us to fireproof our constitution from similar events ever happening again.
I was going to call Ollie Glover, but I wasn't sure whether the Minister wanted to do that next. But I'll call Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, this motion is first and foremost about the victims of the appalling crimes of Jeffrey Epstein and his many associates, as well as the importance of protecting people from abuse of power. But it also has significant implications for wider political culture. As my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, articulately outlined, this and previous governments have been racked by scandal of many kinds. And this whole Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor affair adds to that by making a very significant contribution to already severe erosion of trust in our politics and institutions. And that is why we are calling for a public inquiry into all aspects of UK and British citizen involvement with Jeffrey Epstein over many years. Now, that inquiry would include, of course, taking account of police and criminal investigations, disclosure and publication of relevant documents. But we must go further. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Many people are talking about the different elements that could be examined during an inquiry. I've even heard some people saying that an inquiry could become too big and take too long. Would he agree with me that there is precedent in this country of having public inquiries in 2 or more parts, and that is a particular structure that the government and government ministers, who I hope would be listening, would consider in order to make sure that some parts of the inquiry that we need to see urgently looked at could happen sooner rather than later?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I think she makes a very practical proposal for how an inquiry could be conducted efficiently with appropriate prioritisation so that the most urgent matters get looked at rather than being bogged down in something that would take much longer. But we must go further. We must also toughen the penalties for breaching the ministerial code. We must create an office of the whistleblower to both protect and to empower and encourage people with valuable information to come forward and to speak up. I also support our calls for an end to negative privilege protections, which have prevented criticism of individuals in the royal family in this House for the reasons that we have heard today in this debate.
Would he give way on that point?
I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. What strikes me as I've listened to this excellent debate actually this afternoon is that everything that our establishment sort of depends on is that the people at the heart of it are nice, trusted, good sorts who won't step out of line, and we don't have the mechanisms in place to challenge when that doesn't turn out to be the case. Would he agree with me that the points that he's outlining about duty, about Office of the Whistleblower and other statutory bodies to put a code around our behaviour in this place and in wider public life is so important, so that we don't just rely on people being good blokes?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I very much agree. There is far too much in British political and wider culture that does rely on taking things on trust and assuming that good motives and good intentions will win the day. Very sadly, the whole affair of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shows that we cannot necessarily rely on that, and that we do need strong processes and procedures and protocols to make sure that we have the highest standards in public life. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all hope that the necessary changes to prevent a repeat of the whole Andrew Mountbatten Windsor affair and abomination and the wider Epstein disgrace can be made within the structures of our current system of constitutional monarchy. Should that prove not to be the case, then we risk that calls for a change to our constitutional arrangements grow louder and more compelling.
Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, before I turn to the wider implications of this debate, it's really important to acknowledge why the Liberal Democrats have pressed for full transparency today. Serious allegations have been raised about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's conduct during his time as the UK's trade envoy, including reports that he claimed taxpayer-funded expenses for so-called massage services and other inappropriate costs. Former senior officials have described a culture of deference in which such claims were barely even questioned, expenses were rubber-stamped, and scrutiny was effectively absent. I will give way.
Honourable friend for giving way. We rightly say that no one in the country is above the law, and recent weeks have reinforced that principle. Surely it must also be true that no one is above our democratic. So do you think the government should now consider bringing the royal household within the scope of Freedom of Information Act to strengthen confidence in our institution?
I thank my honourable friend for making that powerful point, and I think it's a really important consideration that I hope the Minister is listening to and can respond to today. These concerns naturally lead to further questions. What did those around Andrew Mountbatten Windsor know? What did police protection officers, civil servants, officials who accompanied him and travelled with him were present during these official duties? What did they observe? What did they record? What did they raise? And crucially, what was dismissed and what was ignored? These are not just trivial matters. They speak directly to how an individual in public office was able to behave in ways that would never be tolerated from anyone else, and how the institutions around him completely and seemingly failed to act.
Just on that point,
We'll give way.
Okay.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And just on this point about what the protection officers knew, for example, does it not show the outrageous power imbalance between a royal and an employee, and how the fact that you have someone in that situation who then has to, and we're talking about whistleblowing, we're talking about reporting what has been seen. Does it just not show how outrageous that even the prospect of having someone in that situation is, that they are then being held to account for not calling out the behaviour of someone whose position, whose privilege, whose kind of birthright has put them into such a position? Does he agree that this just shows how our constitution and our structure has put us into such an outrageous twist, and how difficult it's going to be to unwind that?
Honourable friend for that intervention, and I completely agree with him, and I suspect this is just a small start on something that's much, much wider, and I imagine there's probably much more information on that to come. As the House turns its attention to the matter of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, I also want to use this moment to refocus our minds on those who have been most consistently forgotten throughout all of this, the victims and survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, and the justice they've been denied for far too many years. It's only because of their bravery in coming forward that we know the true extent of Epstein's crimes and the deeply troubling implications that those crimes hold for our own establishment, as has just been mentioned. Madam Deputy Speaker, when we talk of these survivors, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Many UK victims are simply too afraid to come forward right now. Their fear is well documented in UK reporting, which describes a greater sense of fear and reticence among British survivors, fear of stigma, fear of being disbelieved, fear of the powerful networks that have long silenced these women and girls. And yet abuse did happen here in the UK. Epstein carried out wrongdoing during extensive and repeated trips to London. These weren't distant or abstract harms. They took place here on UK soil under UK jurisdiction, and so they demand a UK-led response. But instead of justice here at home, victims were effectively steered, and are still steered, Madam Deputy Speaker, into a US justice system. They're told to seek redress through the Epstein Victims Compensation Programme and a fund that ultimately paid $120 million to around 135 survivors, and did so more quickly and confidentially than litigation could. Now, that programme has been open internationally, and victims here in Britain could apply without needing a lawyer, making it less costly and less traumatic. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, what does it say about our own UK justice system when British victims who are abused here on British soil are left seeking justice 4,000 miles away? When we ask traumatised people to navigate foreign bureaucracies because we here in the United Kingdom have nothing equivalent to offer them? And what does it say that only less than a handful of UK victims even approached a solicitor? Not because abuse didn't happen, we know that it did, but because the absence of any UK prosecution meant they didn't feel empowered to speak. We can draw a stark contrast between figures like Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, Peter Mandelson, who have allegedly enriched themselves through their associations, with the survivors who are left fighting for justice. What the Epstein files reveal is a powerful network of wealthy people colluding with Epstein, using their privilege to silence and dismiss survivors, a pattern which has been highlighted by the End Violence Against Women Coalition. This exposes how powerful men evade consequences, while their victims struggle even to be heard, reinforcing the very fear that continues to keep British survivors in the shadows. Surely the role of this House, of any democratic institution worth its name, is not simply to just reinforce that silence, but to finally break it. And that's why today we call clearly and firmly for the UK to open criminal prosecution and survivor-led inquiries into London-based offences. These alleged crimes fall squarely within the UK jurisdiction. The offender's nationality is irrelevant, the victim's nationality is irrelevant. What matters is that the harms occurred here, and those harmed deserve justice here. Justice for British victims must not be outsourced abroad. Justice must not be dependent on the bravery of a handful willing to defy enormous pressure. Justice must not be conditional on navigating a foreign compensation scheme. Justice should be delivered transparently, confidently and compassionately here in Britain.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that having a public inquiry would be a very public way for the British authorities, for the state, to show those survivors that they have been the victim of some heinous crimes, and that it would give them more confidence to come forward? And we know that survivors of all kinds of sexual abuse and rape across this country, whether it be part of some big scandal like Mohammed Al-Fayed or Epstein, or whether it be something much more local and individual, all of them will be being re-traumatised again and again and again by seeing this splashed across the front pages of the papers and all over the media day after day after day. And we have to make a stand and say enough. We will not tolerate this in this country, and we have to stand up to these powerful men who silence their victims and ensure that they have to fight for justice every step of the way.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that excellent intervention. I couldn't agree more that a public inquiry is very much needed to expose all of the harms that have been done to these victims and how the establishment of our country have seemingly played such a central role in that. Madam Deputy Speaker, if our government is sincere when it speaks of a fairer, safer and more accountable society, it must now show leadership rather than continued deference. It must show survivors they will be believed, protected and heard in the UK, because at the heart of this matter are not titles, reputations or institutions, but people. Survivors whose lives, like the victims of domestic abuse, have been shaped by fear, by silence and by power wielded against them rather than for them. They deserve far better. They deserve a justice system that will fight for them. And now is the time for immediate action. So please, will the Minister consider not redacting any of the documents which don't relate to the ongoing police investigation? Will the government look at, as my honourable friend has just suggested, a public inquiry, a full public inquiry into Epstein and his links to the British establishment? And finally, will the Minister please go away and look to end the appalling negative privilege which prevents MPs in this House from speaking freely about members of the royal household? This is a disgusting symptom of the deference we have shown to those in positions of power at the cost of victims. Our constituents should no longer be silenced in what should be our proud British democracy. Thank you.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Lisa Smart.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we've had an extremely powerful debate today, and I'll address a number of the points that have been raised. But I want to start by talking about how the revelations of recent weeks and recent months have been shattering for the British public and deeply, deeply distressing for many of those directly impacted. We've listened to the gut-wrenching stories of abuse endured by vulnerable women and girls, and we were reminded by my colleague, the member for North East Fife, that we are in many cases talking about children here. We've learned of the arrogance and cruelty of rich, powerful men who felt that no rules applied to them and who made a mockery of our values and our laws. And we have seen laid bare the hollowness of a political establishment that was manipulated so easily and who treated state secrets like cheap gossip. Public trust has been catastrophically undermined by the Epstein saga, and we are now at a crossroads in our public life. If Parliament does not act with courage, faith in our institutions will suffer even more permanent harm and will remain under intense public suspicion and unease. To start to repair the damage, we must uncover the full and unvarnished truth. Critical to that process is demanding that every relevant department comes clean and shares what was known about Mountbatten Windsor's appointment as Special Representative for Trade and Investment, about what concerns were raised ahead of his appointment if his suitability came into question, and what risks were identified throughout that process. The British people deserve to know what behaviour was tolerated and by whom, and they deserve to... I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, because on that point I have a constituent who contacted me who played a public role in the Middle East, and during that role they said they had to go through incredible checks, background checks, etc. And obviously the release of these files would enable us to see actually if the same background checks that are applied to people in public life, you know, to citizens like us, are also applied to the royal family. Does my honourable friend agree?
So I'm grateful to my honourable friend's intervention, also to her constituent who's contacted her about this really important point. My view and the view of the Liberal Democrats is that we should get to the bottom of how this role was created, the vetting that was done before the appointment, to understand the extent of that vetting or the lack of the extent of that vetting. If somebody is being paid by the public purse, they should be held to an extremely high standard, and there should be transparency about their role and the creation of that role to begin with. So I very much agree with her. The public deserve to know if sections of their government of its time put in place systems to shield Mountbatten Windsor from accountability, even at a cost to the national interest. Now, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the police must undertake their work unimpeded. And of course, anybody who has committed a crime should face justice if they are found to have committed that crime. But a police investigation, no matter what prosecution it leads to, is not enough. It is essential for the strength of our constitution and our social fabric that we go further and clean up the broken system that facilitated this scandal in the first place.
On that point,
with pleasure.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. One of the points that's been raised this afternoon is that even whilst the police go ahead with their investigations, there is still a job for this House to do. And it strikes me that some of the most basic principles that we assume in this place and when we come to this place are really being questioned. I just wonder if she would agree with me that it is worth restating for the record and for the public that there are certain principles in public life that this case is highlighting we have to make sure remain in place, that no one is above the law, that taxpayers' money and public office must be used for the public interest and not for private gain, that Parliament has not just the right but the duty to hold the powerful to account and to pursue all means of transparency, and that ultimately all powerful people must face a reckoning if they were involved in this scandal.
Yeah. I wholly agree with my honourable friend. She's made a number of very powerful interventions throughout this debate. And this whole sorry saga repeatedly brings up arrogant, greedy, men, mostly men, who have behaved in a way that has sought to enrich them further and increase their power.
Just on that point.
With pleasure.
I hope this adds to her point, because does she find the irony that the only person who has been imprisoned as part of the Epstein scandal is a woman?
He is not the only person to refer to structural sexism in this debate, and I think particularly my colleague and honourable friend, the member for Frome and East Somerset, made an extremely powerful speech about how we could, should we choose to do so as a parliament, embed looking at sexism, at violence against women and girls, in our policy making, in our thinking, in a way that would benefit the whole of society. And I'm grateful for him raising the point that there remain many people for whom the hand of justice is yet to seek them out with the full vigour with which it should. We should be pulling back the curtain on Andrew's use of the special envoy role and the whole system around him, on the power he had in an official state-sanctioned position, and on the many opportunities missed for scrutiny and accountability, not least, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this place. A number of members across both sides of the House have talked about the importance of pace and of speed. I think the member for Sherwood Forest made a very good point that I think he raised earlier this week to the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister about making sure we get on with some of this. And indeed, the Father of the House reminded us that the wheels of justice often grind slowly. My friend, my Deputy Leader indeed, and the member for St Albans gave some really practical solutions about how we can make sure progress continues at pace, to make sure that one thing isn't holding up another. And indeed, the Shadow Minister reminded us that police involvement in this should not unduly delay the whole of the process. It is, of course, an absolutely vital part that the police should be free to do their job and do it well, but that should not unduly hold up the release of the information we are seeking. We Liberal Democrats very much welcome support from across the chamber for our motion today, including from the Treasury bench. And I wonder when he's winding up if the Minister could confirm, like when the government was responding to the previous humble address that we discussed in this place, that information will be released when it is available, that is, any information will be released when it's available, only holding back that information that is directly relevant to a police investigation. And I'd be grateful if he could do that when he's on his feet in a few moments.
On that point,
please go ahead.
I'm grateful.